Hi, we're back to talking with Professor Kathryn Hanley from biology at NMSU. This is Science Let's Take a Look on KTAL LP FM in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 101.5. I'm your host, Vince Gucic. We have gone over all kinds of topics about these emerging viral diseases like Zika, chikungunya, and dengue. And there's some topics to clean up, although we could go on for a very long time. I remember when you talked about the problem with dengue vaccine, that it had better work for all 4 strains, or it will be worse if you get the second strain. And I just saw that some vaccine was withdrawn for that reason.
That's right. So there are 4 different, what we call serotypes of dengue. Dengue's 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first time you get infected, you're likely to get what's called classical dengue. So you can be in the hospital for quite a long time, but you're unlikely to die. Your second infection, though, with a different serotype is where you really get hammered and you can develop dengue hemorrhagic fever. And it really doesn't matter in what order those serotypes happen, right? Yeah. So when you're developing a vaccine for dengue, you have to have what we call tetravalent immunity. You have to have immunity to all 4 serotypes. And this is why it has taken so long to get a vaccine for dengue, even though this is something the Army has wanted desperately since World War II. So Sanofi Pasteur developed a vaccine for dengue that they had licensed not in the U.S., but in Mexico and I think 12 other, maybe 14 other countries. And this was licensed despite the fact that they knew that immunity to one of the serotypes was not particularly strong from this vaccine. And now they are finding that in certain cases, in certain circumstances, the vaccine actually enhances disease when people become infected with wild-type virus, which they do. And this is, of course, the opposite of what you want to achieve with a vaccine. So they're under pressure to withdraw the vaccine in some countries. And this is a vaccine that I have been speaking out against for many years because this problem was fairly obvious to people who knew to look for it.
Is there a clue or clues about why it's worse with the second serotype infection?
Yes, we have a good explanation for that, which is that, and I'll simplify this a little, but that when you get your first infection with dengue, you do produce antibody, and antibody is a good thing, right? It's what protects you from subsequent infection. But there's 2 kinds of antibodies. One is specific to the type. So if you got dengue 3, you get type-specific antibody to dengue 3, and you'll never get dengue 3 again for the rest of your life. The other type of antibody will bind to the other 3 serotypes, but the problem is it won't kill them. It won't neutralize them. So instead, what it does is it binds to the actual virion, and it flags the virion to the immune system saying, hey, I'm here. So then the immune system will come and pick up those viruses. But because the virus isn't dead, it's still capable of infection, and dengue is a virus that infects cells of the immune system. So it's like buying a speed pass to Disneyland. You get in faster than you would have if you had to wait in the regular line.
Ouch.
And so you actually have a worse infection.
Worse, you said it's hemorrhagic. What else happens, or is that really the main killer?
The main killer is shock because your blood volume becomes dysregulated. So you're bleeding out through your capillaries, not something you want to do, and then your blood pressure goes wrong, and then you can die of shock.
So is there symptomatic treatment, or is it just too
So you can replace volume. You can get an IV, for example, to help people. But again, there's no specific treatment for dengue.
And if you do survive it, you're in for a long time at the hospital.
You're
right?
very, very sick.
Yeah. Huh. Okay, and that brings up another topic, which is where do these viruses stand in, you might even say fear factor, in the rank for morbidity, which is basically sickness, disability, and mortality.
Right. So they're not certainly the most important cause of mortality in the developed world, certainly. So, and I think you always need to make the distinction between what's happening in rich countries and what's happening in poor countries, because the landscape of public health is totally different. In rich countries, we worry about chronic diseases like diabetes, obstructive airway disease, diseases like that. We worry about influenza. If you go to Africa, they don't worry about flu because they have bigger things to worry about than flu.
Right.
So if you're going to talk, though, globally about the landscape, then there are still other agents that are going to result in more mortality. Dirty water and dirty air are very high among them. Nonetheless, they rank within the top 10, and they are, to some degree, agents where we do know how to control them. So some of the chronic diseases are harder to control. We have a better idea how to control infectious diseases, but it requires investment, money, development of new drugs and vaccines.
And that would typically be done in the developed countries for the less developed, and that's a problem.
Well, I hesitate to say you're doing it for the less developed countries. It's a global society. I know that you were just in Vietnam, right? So a vaccine that's developed in the U.S. that protects you against dengue directly benefits you, and it prevents you from bringing dengue back to Las Cruces, where we have the vectors for dengue. So any public health intervention is developed for the world, and it benefits everybody.
How many people would it take to bring back dengue, importing it from another country? I mean, that's a complicated question, but...
Oh, in order to seed an outbreak?
Yes.
It would depend a little bit on whether it was appreciated that you had come back with dengue. And physicians in this country are not well equipped to actually diagnose the quote-unquote tropical diseases. And so if you went undiagnosed and then the virus got a foothold and a few more cases picked up, and not every case is symptomatic, just as in Zika virus, it could get a pretty good foothold before anybody noticed.
That's not terribly comforting.
No, it's not terribly comforting.
Okay. Brings up another thing sort of related to development, and that is the hygiene hypothesis that some of the diseases that are occurring now, well, asthma and so on, come from having an insufficiently challenged immune system in youth. And one of the cases that was cited in a recent article, I believe in Nature, was that of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who developed polio, I believe, age 39.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's actually, you're talking about two different things, so let me kind of tease them apart. In the case of polio, it was interesting to watch that in the United States, as sanitation got better, before we had a vaccine, polio got worse. Why is that? Because as sanitation got better, people still got polio, but they got it at an older age. And for some of these viruses, it is much worse to develop them as adults than to develop them as children. And so in the case of Roosevelt, he developed polio from swimming in a contaminated lake. And he was in his 30s or 40s and, of course, became paralyzed. Whereas if he had been exposed to it as a baby, he might not have gotten so sick. So that's one instance where sanitation is actually not necessarily making people become infected more often, but they're getting infected at an older age and the consequences are worse. The hygiene hypothesis for asthma and for autoimmunity is the notion that we co-evolved as humans with worms. And if you go back and look at coprolites from tens of thousands of years ago, you can find worms. And it's a very, very recent phenomenon, within the last 100 years that our guts are worm-free.
The last 100 years?
Sure. So I think if you look back 100 years ago, at least in most parts of the country, kids would have been exposed to hookworm. They would have been exposed to other forms of worms. It's much more recent that we moved indoors. We got rid of pets. We don't interact with farms. We don't do any of the activities, not everyone, but many people don't do any of the activities that expose them to worms. We have antibacterial soaps. We've become slightly obsessive about ruling all possible infective agents out of our lives. And the thought is that because of that, we're actually missing a key component that actually trains our immune system to act appropriately, and the immune system turns on itself. And there's quite good evidence that children who grow up in countries with high worm burden, so if you look at kids in Madagascar, they just don't have these kinds of autoimmune problems that kids who grow up in Brooklyn do.
Yeah, we've been to Madagascar, although there was a lot of many problems that weren't related to worms.
And worms are not always a good thing. They at high levels, of course, they cause malnutrition. They are themselves a disease agent. But at low levels, it is thought that perhaps they're beneficial. And what's really neat, I know we're running out of time, is that Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disease of the gut. One of the treatments that's being pioneered for Crohn's disease is to give people with Crohn's disease pig whipworm. So to actually introduce a foreign worm into the gut, and it actually does lead to abatement of the symptoms of Crohn's disease for a fairly long period of time.
Even in an adult?
Even in an adult, yes.
Huh.
It's not a permanent fix, but it has been known to help.
Huh. And I remember reading somewhere about, maybe it was on NPR, somebody had said, I want to infect my child with chickenpox so they get immunity. And that doesn't sound like such a great idea, or does it?
If we didn't have a vaccine, maybe, but we have a perfectly good vaccine for chickenpox. Just give your child the vaccine.
Yeah, I had chickenpox.
Yes.
I had measles, mumps, German measles, and I came through them all. Although mumps was really awful.
Yes, I have heard the reports about how bad mumps were.
Yeah.
And, people forget, actually. So not so much mumps, but for example, with measles, people forget that measles is not the same thing as chickenpox. It's not a tame disease. 1 in every 200 children infected with measles will die or experience some severe debility. Hundreds of thousands of children still die a year of measles in Africa. So to treat measles as if it were trivial and to not vaccinate your child because it won't matter if they get measles is a false sense of assurance.
What's the difference between here and there, you might say, about measles? Because I know that measles is a big mortality factor worldwide.
We can afford the vaccine. We're rich.
No, but
in terms of
when I was young,
Yeah.
nobody worried about measles. Oh, it's a childhood disease. You'll get over it.
Right. They should have worried about measles. And probably your physicians did worry about measles when you were young.
They didn't tell me.
Yeah. Perhaps that was just as well. You seem to have been a very germy child.
Right. Okay. Well, we have about 1 minute left before they break in with Linea Abierta.
Okay.
And that's always sort of exciting when suddenly this music starts coming up and so on. Is there anything you'd like to add? Oh, let me just say, okay, we've been talking with Professor Kathryn Hanley, biology at NMSU. You're on listening to Science. Let's take a look on KTAL LP FM 101.5. And let Kathy have the last word, the last 30 seconds.
Sure. I want to promote the fact that it is critical to understand evolution in order to understand the future of these pathogens, and that if you try to sweep evolution under the rug and pretend it doesn't happen, then you're going to pay for it when we get pathogens evolving to the selection we've imposed and we can no longer treat them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the visit, and I'm sure this is very illuminating for all of our listeners. And we'll let the other programs come on right now. Thank you for listening.